Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. I first read Stephen Crane for the very first English course that I took in college. We read The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky, and just in case you don't know, for a little bit of context, that is a short story that is very often assigned reading here in the English classes in the US. A couple of semesters after that, for another course on US literature, we read Maggie, a Girl of the Streets. Now I have to be honest with you, I don't really recall having read that for that course. So yes, Jorge is not perfect. But I can tell you that I read it, at least for sure, some years later. So that was my experience with Stephen Crane up to that point. But fast forward a couple more years, I'm still in college, and I had the opportunity to take a wonderful course. This was a US history course on the Civil War. So it was one of those courses that really I have a very, very vivid memory of, because it was just very, very well put together. So for that class, I wrote an essay on the Civil War writings of Herman Melville and Stephen Crane. So of course, if I was going to do that, I had to look at the Red Badge of Courage. Now, why did I decide to reread this book other than to tell you about it, right? So about a month ago, I was at my library, at the place where I work, and I realized I was just looking at the movies, and I saw that they had a copy of the film, The Red Badge of Courage, and I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know that there was a film made of this great story. So I picked it up and I was like, this is the perfect excuse to reread the book by Stephen Crane, and of course then I can tell you about it, so why not? So the first thing we're going to do is I want to go a little bit into the publication context, share some ideas with you on that, and also tell you a little bit about the particular edition that I have, which is the one that I have just shown you. So The Red Badge of Courage. It was published in 1895 when Stephen Crane was not quite, a little bit less than 24 years old. And that, I don't know, it just puts me to shame. Okay, I think of where I was when I was 23, 24. I mean, I think about where I am right now, and I'm I feel a little bit shameful, when compared to the achievement of Stephen Crane. And this book was very well received from the very start. So from that first moment when it was published, it was received, it just came out to critical acclaim, but also, this is very important, it in time came to be also very well regarded by authors, by other great authors. So if you publish something and you're appreciated by the critics, that's fantastic, but if you can also have the appreciation of great authors, that is amazing too. Joseph Conrad, okay, Theodore Dreiser, all of these great authors, Ernest Hemingway eventually, H.G. Wells. I mean, these are huge names, and they all greatly admired the Red Badge of Courage. At the time that it was published, and I thought this was interesting, this was something that I remembered from when I put together that essay for that class. Many critics actually assumed that this book had been written by a veteran of the Civil War. It is so vivid in the descriptions that they just assumed that Stephen Crane had actually fought in the Civil War. Stephen Crane never saw a battle in his entire life, okay? And he was actually born, by the time that he was born, the Civil War had been over for a very long time. I'm thinking of the years, don't take my word for this, but I believe the Civil War took place between 1861 and 1865, I want to say, and Stephen Crane was born in 1871. He unfortunately passed away in the year 900 at a very early age. So he read about the war. That was something that, the way that he came to know about the war, and he also heard the stories from the veterans, from the people who had fought in it, who were not that old at the time. So you could say that he grew up with the Civil War. Even if he had not experienced it directly, he knew a lot about it. Now, my edition this is the one that I got back then when I wrote that essay for that class. This is the Modern Library paperback edition. And the good thing about it, if it's still on print, I believe it's still on print. So if you can find this one, I really recommend this version of the text, because it comes with quite a few pages of additional commentary by other authors. And it also comes with an additional short story titled The Veteran. This story has the same protagonist as The Red Badge of Courage, Henry Fleming, the soldier, when he's older. So he's looking back. And it also adds a little bit to the story. It's a really nice coda. So no matter what edition you have, If you do decide to read The Red Badge of Courage, please take an extra few minutes, only 10 pages long, to read that short story, The Veteran. It's also included, in the Library of America edition of Crane's works, which, by the way, I have that edition. I have shown it to you in one of my bookshelf tours. I'm not showing it right now because there's not really much to it. It's one of those Library of America, but it's missing the dust jacket, so it just looks like a green book. I got that it was on clearance, actually. I paid like $3 for it. I was like, wow, this is amazing. But anyway, let's not get sidetracked here. We're going to start with the Borges Connection here. Okay, it's been a while since I touched upon the Borges Connection, but you may know that Jorge Luis Borges, with Esther Semborain, published this little book, Introduction to North American Literature. A great introduction, by the way. And they dedicated about a page or so to The Red Badge of Courage and the works of Stephen Crane. So I just wanted to read to you what Borges and Semborain said about this text before we go into it. So this is what they said. The novel's subject is the Civil War, experienced by a soldier who doesn't know whether he's a coward or a brave man until events have put him to the test. The loneliness of each soldier during the battle, his complete ignorance of the strategy guiding the action, his fluctuations of courage and fear, his stupor at the short duration of an infantry charge which seemed endless, and the limited ground conquered, quote, the brave dream of weary men, unquote, are some of the many things captured in this vivid book. Its only sin is perhaps an excess of metaphors. That last part, that last sentence right there, the only sin, is the only critical piece that we have in this brief introduction or brief comment on The Red Badge of Courage. By the way, that part that is between quotations, I was not able to find the source for that, so I am not sure where it comes from, but they seem to be quoting something. Now, regarding that use of metaphors, of course, if you look at the title, the very title of this text, The Red Badge of Courage, is a metaphor in itself. But honestly, I did not think as I read it that the metaphors were excessive. So I must say that in this case, I do not agree with Borges and Semborain when it comes to that. So let's look very briefly at the plot, the story right here. The Red Badge of Courage is the story of a young soldier by the name of Henry Fleming. He goes to war and he is anxious to find out whether, in the thick of battle, he's going to fight or run. So a lot of what this book deals with is that old idea of fight or flight. That is the tension. That is how the tension happens and how we experience it as readers. Now, Henry Fleming, throughout the novel, he's referred to as the youth by the narrator. So we learn his name from maybe other characters, but he's always referred to as the youth. He is a romantic. He's a Don Quixote figure. Okay, we talked about Don Quixote before, so there it is once again. And his notion of war, going back to this idea of romanticism, is just straight out of Homer. He has read the classics, and that is the concept that he has of what war is like. He even expects his mother to tell him to come back with his shield or on it. So you can tell there's a connection right there with that classical idea and notion of war. But he soon finds out that war in actuality involves a lot of waiting, a lot of aimless walking, that there's not really that much fighting, and when the fighting happens, it seems to be over really, really quickly. So he comes to long at some point, not only for the fight itself, but also for a wound, the Red Badge of Courage, that would prove his valor to himself and to others. This is a character who is very, very self-conscious, but also, conscious of what other people may think of him. Now, I really like the first chapter of this story because in the first chapter you already see a lot of what is involved in this book. So that's why I wanted to share with you some passages from this chapter 1. If you read the very first paragraph, okay, so let me share that with you. It has a very long introduction. I forgot to mention this, by the way. More than 50 pages by Shelby Foote. Okay, I also read Shiloh by Shelby Foote for that class. So I don't remember the introduction, but I enjoyed reading him. So let me read you the first paragraph here. The cold passed reluctantly from the earth, and the retiring fogs revealed an army stretched out on the hills, resting. As the landscape changed from brown to green, the army awakened and began to tremble with eagerness at the noise of rumors. It cast its eyes upon the roads, which were growing from long troughs of liquid mud to proper thoroughfares. A river, amber-tinted in the shadow of its banks, purled at the army's feet. And at night, when the stream had become of a sorrowful blackness, one could see across it the red, eye-like gleam of hostile campfires set in the low brows of distant hills. So from that very first paragraph, you already get this great description, the idea of the army as a unified thing, and also that idea of waiting, that idea of resting. I don't know, I read this paragraph, and from the very start I thought to myself, I am in the presence of a masterpiece. You know, there are certain books that you just read a passage and you can tell that this is going to be a very powerful reading experience. I have something also here from page 13 that I wanted to share with you, and it has to do with this romanticism versus reality type of theme. He had had the belief that real war was a series of death struggles with small time in between for sleep and meals. But since his regiment had come to the field, the army had done little but sit still and try to keep warm. So romanticism versus reality. You could also say that a theme of this book is simply literature versus life, because his idea of war comes directly from classical literature, and he realizes that life is very different than that, the real thing. So I think chapter 1 is just incredibly rich. Okay, you can tell from this chapter, it gives you all of the greatness of this novel. Much of the greatness of this novel is already present in it, and I think that is one of the reasons why we consider this novel to be so great, because it has that ability to dazzle you from the very beginning. It really captures you, and very few books do that. So Stephen Crane was just a very, very effective storyteller, and just a great writer also. So an important theme I was kind of suggesting before is that idea of insecurity and the desire for validation, right? That is what Henry feels. That is one of the reasons why he wants that red badge of courage. And he is constantly comparing himself to others. Okay, that's one of his problems. That is maybe one of his tragic flaws. And he thinks that he is the only one to experience that fear. You know, it's one of those situations where you wonder if, you know, is anybody else feeling the way I do? He is described as a mental outcast by the narrator at one point. He feels separated from the rest, from his peers, because of this fear that he experiences, and he doesn't really know if other people are experiencing the same thing. Now, I think most readers, this is also part of the greatness of the Red Badge of Courage, will be able to identify with this, at least at the allegorical level. Even if we have not been to war, even if we have not experienced a single battle, I think most of us know what it's like to have that feeling, the feeling that maybe I may not be quite up to the task when the time comes. Okay, quick example. I remember when I was younger, when I was actually young, you know, I was really, really scared. For example, when I was about to begin high school. Okay, I remember that summer in Argentina. It's the summer, and then you know, we begin the school year in about March. So I remember I was terrified. I thought to myself, am I going to be able to? I spent that entire summer basically worrying about that, because the teachers before had put a lot of fear into us, telling us, oh, you're going to have to sweat for that passing grade, you know, and all that stuff. So high school, when I was about to start college, am I going to be able to do it? When I was going to start grad school, when I was going to start teaching, okay, the first class, I would like to share my thoughts on that with you someday. You know, that feeling of, you know, you've been given a class, now you have to teach it. You know, very interesting. Something that I haven't experienced, but I'm sure is, you know, quite a similar situation too. The maybe anxiety of parenthood. Am I going to be able to be a good parent? You know, so all of those things. And I think this is, you know, a large part of what this book is all about. The style is, you know, it's just vintage Stephen Crane that you get here. If you read this book, and only this book by Stephen Crane, you get an idea of what his style is like. You just get a sense of the realism and how good he was at conveying that. For example, there's a famous passage in this novel about the moment when Henry encounters a corpse, and I wanted to read you the description of that, because here you can see perfectly the realism. So it is on page 88. He was being looked at by a dead man who was seated with his back against a column-like tree. The corpse was dressed in a uniform that once had been blue, but was now faded to a melancholy shade of green. The eyes, staring at the youth, had changed to the dull hue to be seen on the side of a dead fish. The mouth was open. Its red had changed to an appalling yellow. Over the gray skin of the face ran little ants. One was trundling some sort of a bundle along the upper lip. Notice the extreme close-up that we get right there with the ant and what the ant is carrying. So it's really quite vivid, as I said before. Based on something that I just read, look out throughout this text for references to the color red. They happen all over the place, every 5 pages, or sometimes even less than that. And I also like about it, this is also part of the style and the description, the notion of war as a monster. War is personified or made into a monster throughout this text. For example, if you go to page 79 of this edition, you have the brigade was hurrying briskly to be gulped into the infernal mouths of the war god. So the war as a monster, but the war as a hungry god that demands blood. If you go to page 128, you also have war, the red animal. War, the blood-swollen god, would have bloated fill. So once again, that idea of war as a monster and the color red coming back all over the place, recurring as a theme right here. There's also, of course, the famous passage that deals with the title. So let me share that with you. It's like a little line right here, or maybe a little paragraph. At times he regarded the wounded soldiers in an envious way. He conceived persons with torn bodies to be peculiarly happy. He wished that he too had a wound, a red badge of courage. So the title is a metaphor, as I was saying before. And I think with those passages that I have shared with you, you get an idea of the style, of the descriptive style of Stephen Crane, which is, among the best that I have encountered, especially in US literature. Now I want to share with you some ideas from 2 authors on the Red Badge of Courage. One of them is Stephen Crane. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what he thought about the novel, and then I'll tell you just a little bit about something that Hemingway said about this text. Okay, so first of all, Crane intended this novel to be what he calls a psychological portrayal of fear. That was his theme, that was his idea with this text. He also has some ideas about preaching that I thought were interesting. He says, preaching is fatal to art in literature. If there is any moral or lesson in it, I do not try to point it out. Tolstoy, are you listening? You know what I'm saying? So yes, he tried not to be condescending to the reader. He was like, okay, this is what I'm trying to portray. This is the story I describe. I let the reader hear the dialogue and then let the reader decide what he or she thinks the moral or the lesson is, if there is any, as he says right here. One interesting thing that I found when reading Crane on the Red Badge of Courage was that he was also a little bit disappointed after the success of the novel. And this is what he says. He says, I was happier in the old days when I was always dreaming of the thing I have now attained. So he felt that he was happy with the result, but now he felt that maybe, what do I do now? It's like when you graduate from college. So now what, right? So that idea of maybe that it's the thrill of the chase rather than, capturing whatever it is that is being chased. So that is Stephen Crane on his own masterpiece. And then Hemingway, for his part, he included the Red Badge of Courage in its entirety in an anthology of war stories. So I imagine, I haven't seen it, but I imagine this book, with short stories, and then all of a sudden you get the Red Badge of Courage, this whole thing, right? And this is what he said. He said, if you want to find out how perfect a piece of writing is, try to cut it for the purpose of making a selection for an anthology. And he says, in this case, the Red Badge of Courage, it cannot be cut. He says, maybe War and Peace, War and Peace, you can cut it and maybe even improve it by cutting, but not the Red Badge of Courage. The Red Badge of Courage has already been cut because Stephen Crane did the editing before the text was published. He says, the Red Badge of Courage, this is Hemingway, it's kind of like a poem. You can't take anything out of it. It's a poem. It's complete. You have to look at it like that, as a whole, right? And that is one of the reasons why this is considered to be such a great text. Now, I left this for sort of last, this idea of genre, okay, genre. And the question here is a very difficult one to me. And that is this a novel or is this a novella? Okay, you know that I like to look at that and that I like to tell you when something is a novella. So at first, when I was reading it, I was thinking about this oscillation between the excitement and the fear that Henry experiences. That is like the theme right here. So I thought, okay, we have that, you know, that pendulum, that pendular motion right here. Maybe this is a novella. I was convinced at the start. But then I kept reading, and after Henry receives his red badge of courage, and by the way, I'm going to let you discover that for yourself, that moment and the circumstances in which it happens, I feel that the story takes a different direction that kind of, includes enough development at least for it to be regarded as a novel. That's how I feel about it. But to be honest with you, this is a text that I really, really have a very difficult time establishing whether we are in the presence of a novel or of a novella. In this edition that I have, which has a lot of extra space to the pages, this is 246 pages in length. I saw an edition at my library recently that was only like 150. And if you look at the Library of America edition, which, as you know, is packed, every page is packed with text, it's only 120 pages long, 24 chapters. I know that that has nothing to do really with the genre, but I don't know. I'm going to ask you, okay, what do you think? Is The Red Badge of Courage a novel or a novella? I think we could make a case of both. It's one of those texts that really defy classification in that case, but I'm willing to listen to arguments on both sides of the story. So I wanted to tell you a little bit, very, very quickly, about the film adaptation. I watched it about a week ago or so. This one came out in 1951. It was directed by John Huston. John Huston, as you know, was great at adapting works. He adapted some really, really difficult texts. Okay, think Under the Volcano, maybe Wise Blood. I don't know how difficult, but still, The Dead. He did a great film of the Dead. I believe that was his final film, by the way. Reflections in a Golden Eye, Moby Dick. There are many, many more. I think he did also The Maltese Falcon. So lots of works, lots of adaptations. Now, with The Red Badge of Courage, what we have, unfortunately, is actually a truncated version of the film, because the studio grabbed the original film, which was like 120 minutes, and shortened it to only 69 minutes. Okay, they said that apparently the initial test audiences did not react well to the movie, so I don't really know. They also added a completely unnecessary narrator's voice. I thought that was really it kind of ruined the experience for me. The good thing about it is that you get a sense of the text of the words of Stephen Crane, but I'm pretty sure that John Huston was not happy about that. Now, even with all this meddling, if you will, this is still a great film. Okay, and I think that shows you when you're in the presence of a masterpiece that even after all the violence that was done to the original text, to the original film, it remains a great film. And John Huston actually considered it to be his masterpiece. Now, he was talking about the one that was like complete, the 120-minute version. It's in black and white, and you get objective battle scenes kind of alternating with really weird angled close-ups. So very similar to what you get in the novel, this idea of the battle, the objective battle scenes, but then on the other hand, the more introspective moments. The movie really does a really, really good job in capturing that. So even if we consider that this has been edited, truncated, mutilated, if you will, I still recommend the film to you, because I think that much of the greatness of the story of The Red Badge of Courage survives in this film adaptation by John Huston. So the bottom line is that The Red Badge of Courage is really one of the great war novels, I believe, along with, I don't know, All Quiet on the Western Front, along with For Whom the Bell Tolls, right? All of these great works. And it's just a perfect example of the narrative art of Stephen Crane. This is really his masterpiece, though he has also written some really, really good stuff in his like shorter works. The Open Boat, for example. The Monster, right? There are so many great stories by Stephen Crane. Maggie, A Girl of the Streets. So no matter where you choose to start with him, it's probably a good place. But I would say The Red Badge of Courage is really, really a text that deserves our attention. And you can see in this novel or novella, depending on how you feel about it, his polished style, for example, his ability to convey an inner reality and an outer reality with equal power. That is something that really amazes me about Stephen Crane. And I would also say his compassion, right? That's very important. And it's all here. It's all here in the Red Badge of Courage. So to put it as simply as possible, read this novel. Okay, please do. I think you're gonna thank me if you have not experienced this text before. And here's a really cool project that I'm just gonna throw at you that I think would be really, really interesting, and that is to read the Red Badge of Courage back to back with Mariano Azuela's The Underdogs, or Los de Abajo. I've done a video on this one. So you got the US Civil War and the Mexican Revolution. Very different texts, very different approach, very different structure. And yes, Los de Abajo, The Underdogs, really is a novella. But I just thought that would be a really cool reading project. So it would be nice to do something like that. Unfortunately, that's not the way that I read them. But if you do go with that, please let me know what you think, you know, of the two works in comparison. They are both of them very, very brief. So this is a reading project that you can take care of in a few days probably. So do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane, a masterpiece of US literature. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.